I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
You are listening to Moderate Rebels. This is part 2 of my discussion with Max Blumenthal and Rania Khalek. Of course, we'll be talking about the war in Syria and continuing the discussion we began in part 1. In part 1, we talked about several things, but specifically the battle for Eastern Ghouta in Syria, Douma, and a variety of other things. We talked about Rania's reporting on the ground in Syria. In this episode, we're going to kind of take a step back a little bit and talk more generally about the war in Syria, and specifically, I think, about our personal trajectories. We've been criticized mostly by people who I think have been somewhat unfair, but I think there are valid criticisms in that early on in the conflict, we were kind of in like a knee-jerk response, supportive of the opposition out of the idea that this is like some progressive revolution against an evil autocratic regime, etc. You know, believing a lot of these talking points, which we now know are significantly more complex, if not just flat out false. So, Max, do you want to talk a bit about this? Because Rania and I addressed it in an interview last year on Dead Pundit Society, but I think with the three of us, it might be good to go into a bit more detail, maybe.
And Rania has addressed it, I think, on a number of occasions. It doesn't matter how many times you address anything, though.
It doesn't.
I mean, people are just going to say what they say, and no one will believe that you're being sincere about why you had a change of heart. But, I think what I did in resigning in 2012 from Akhbar as the Syrian crisis, the Syrian conflict became heavily militarized, was, first of all, probably the biggest mistake I've made in journalism because of the way I went about it, which was grandstanding, and the result of I wouldn't say pressure I was under, but more influence I was under by people who today, some people who we know, who today are completely on the other side and have also kind of backed away, but didn't make the same kind of public stand. I made this public stand that I now see as foolish and juvenile and grandstanding. Part of it had to do with the fact that I was imposing my understanding of Palestine, projecting it onto the Syrian situation. I didn't take a serious look at what was actually going on. And I also imposed my understanding of Islamophobia in the West onto the Syrian situation and conflated a narrative with a totally different reality that I didn't fully understand at the time. I had signed on to be a columnist at Al-Akhbar right before things really popped off in Syria in like July 2011. And, I was in Beirut. There were like some fist fights on Hamra or outside the Syrian embassy, but like the situation wasn't as militarized then. And I didn't think it was going to become, the 7-year devastating conflict that it became. And when it did, I became sort of uncomfortable because what I was preparing to do was release my book Goliath and, really focus on Israel-Palestine. And all of a sudden, I was at a paper that had taken an anti-imperialist position, in defense of the Syrian government and its ability to maintain, to survive. There were two columnists, Amal Saad Gorayeb and Sharmeen Narwani, who'd been brought in, who were really going after the opposition narrative, maybe maybe in a strident way, maybe not. But I was just deeply uncomfortable about having my column next to theirs and saw myself sort of as a fig leaf and didn't understand that what they were writing at the time was essentially correct. And what Sharmeen Narwani and Amal Saad Gorayeb wrote then was absolutely, now it's just pretty clear. They were right. And what I wrote in my resignation letter is largely discredited and was wrong. And I don't have any problem admitting it. I just haven't really gotten to the chance to sit down and write it. But I've known that for several years. If you actually look at my work on Syria in 2013, when the red line was imposed, I started writing about the propaganda that was used, particularly how Israeli intelligence influenced the establishment of a red line and how dangerous it was. I even raised questions about the alleged chemical attack in East Ghouta that year. This has been forgotten, along with my work exposing the Syrian Emergency Task Force in 2013, which was the main arm of the Syrian opposition in Washington pushing for war before the white helmets were a thing or any of that. So I was going hard against regime change, but I had this perspective that I suspect both of you had, where, both sides are just evil and, there has to be a third way, but we have to make sure the U.S. doesn't bomb because, Iraq was bad. And, I was also pretty quiet on Libya and not really, didn't really make any coherent statements about that either. So it really, I went through this process where after the deal between the Russian government and the Obama administration and the Syrian government to disarm their chemical weapons, I breathed a sigh of relief, and I decided, my book Goliath on Israel-Palestine was coming out that year. I'm just going to focus on Palestine. It turned out I was getting a lot of pats on the back from certain elements within the Palestine solidarity movement because of the stand I had taken on Syria. I didn't even realize that. I just was relieved that I didn't have to engage in this question anymore. And I really just tapped out. It didn't take a lot of time to focus on what was actually happening. It really took until 2016, after I'd done 2 extensive book tours on Palestine and really, along with you, Rania, we'd done a lot of work on Palestine, and the Eastern Aleppo operation started to kind of preoccupy Western media, and a lot of the perception management operations that the Syrian opposition had set up after failing in 2013 started to take hold. And I started to kind of not only come to my senses, because I realized that an intervention at this point by the U.S. would be a recipe for catastrophe, but that we were simply being lied to and being deceived. I took like 3 weeks or a month off from my work and just read everything I could about Syria and tried to understand who the insurgents were. I started making phone calls. Maybe some people listening to this will remember getting a call from me to people whose voices I had ignored, to ask them questions, to speak to them about what they saw inside Syria. And it was extremely eye-opening. And I agreed to participate in this debate at Verso in New York with Mufta, which has been, just like a completely absurd joke of a magazine scraping the bottom of the barrel of, pro-regime change opinion.
They published an entire special issue on Salafism and Wahhabism, featuring multiple articles defending Salafism and Wahhabism, including one of the most ridiculous articles I've ever seen in my entire life, which is written by a right-wing libertarian free marketer who talks about Milton Friedman and Salafism and why free market fundamentalism and Wahhabi fundamentalism go hand in hand. Mufta published that.
So yeah, when you start kind of doing your due diligence on Syria and talking to people who've been right all along, you see this bullshit for what it is. And I agreed to participate in that debate just as a form of penance for my resignation from Akhbar, and to try to communicate what I'd learned to a room full of people who, first of all, self-identifying as leftists and seemed to be pretty much fooled by the same narrative that had taken me in. I may have gone a little soft when I look back at that debate, but it was the beginning of a process of publicly challenging these narratives that have been wielded, I think, to cultivate pro-war, pro-regime change opinion and to neuter the anti-war movement in the left. And it's been kind of a mission of mine to just throw myself into the debate and to do what I can to mainstream, or at least, open up space for a lot of the, facts and reporting and analysis that more marginal people had been saying all along. Just briefly, I mean, I did an investigative series for the Gray Zone Project when we were at Alternet on the white helmets. I really knew that I was going to be attacked harshly for that, but the attacks I received were actually more harsh than what I received for my work on Palestine from the organized international pro-Israel lobby. I not only received attacks after, but before. Idris Ahmad, who's a journalism professor at Stirling University in Scotland, called me to threaten me before the article came out. I received threatening WhatsApp messages, probably from, it appears to be from someone named Az Kaderji, whose real name is Omar Kaderji. And, you know, the usual suspects began setting in on me. Many of them were the same people who'd congratulated me on my Akhbar resignation. And so they were deeply, deeply upset that I'd kind of turned on them. I think they felt like they lost an asset. And, you know, they haven't stopped with me. But one of the things they've accused me of is kind of taking a payoff from Moscow to change my opinion. I mean, they ignored what I had been saying in 2013 and that there was a real basis for me opposing regime change. But also, they want to kind of deflect from the fact that I actually just took a serious look at Syria and decided that they were completely wrong, and that many other people, including you guys, have done the same thing. I went to RT's 10th anniversary just because I was invited, and I was on a speaking tour in Finland, so it was like an hour away. And I was just interested to see what it was all about. I participated in a public media event there. Like, everything I did was public. I didn't take any fees. I'm happy to work with RT. I actually think it should be considered more admirable than working with Al Jazeera, which has been an arm of, you know, Gulf and American soft power, but that's beside the point. I've done paid work for Al Jazeera too, but nobody accused me of, you know, being a Qatari asset. I didn't even speak about Syria on RT until April 2017. So none of that adds up. I really owe the explanation to the people I attacked, specifically Amal Saad Ghorayeb and Sharmeen Narwani. And, you know, I owe them an apology. I have for a long time. And it just took me years to understand what they knew from the beginning to get to this point. I definitely plan on writing about this more, but I would urge people to follow their work. And I guess this would be, you know, a time if you guys want to say anything more about how you changed on the Syrian situation and why you decided that the narrative that we've been following all along was bullshit.
Well, I think that was a really good explanation. I would say that a lot of what you said applies to me in terms of my misunderstanding of Syria, as in applying the sort of Palestine narrative onto Syria and the sort of Western Islamophobia narrative onto Syria. That played a huge role.
Like that Assad is an occupier and that
Assad is like an Alawite dictator who is just like massacring Sunnis because he's a genocidal psychopath. And that also had to do with the people surrounding me in some cases. But, you know, I also had a contradiction in my own life, and I've explained this in other forums, as Max said, but I'll just briefly go over it. I have family in Syria. I come from a minority background. My family is Lebanese Druze, and obviously my family in Syria is Syrian Druze. I'm personally an atheist. I don't really care either way, but in the Middle East that matters because sect is like a big deal.
Well, and a lot of people don't understand. It matters not just. It's not about what you believe personally. Like, even if you don't, if you don't practice the religion, if you don't believe in it, you're still identified as part of it because it's kind of your cultural background.
No, exactly. And I mean, when it comes to, you know, Salafi jihadist groups, you're either an infidel or you're not, or you're killable, you know, based on your sect. I mean, that's pretty much, they have like rules for this. And someone like me, whether I'm a practicing Druze person or not, I'm considered somebody who's killable, or somebody who should be forcibly converted, or somebody who's even enslavable, based on their rules. And so these are the things, you know, when I say I have family in Syria, they're not huge fans. I mean, they're not huge fans of the government. Like most Syrians, like they have issues with the government. A lot of people do, but it's a matter of what the alternative is. And for them, the alternative is people who want to kill them, or forcibly convert them or take their land. And so this was a huge contradiction for me that was like ongoing. I used to get into fights with my parents, I used to apply a lot of the same comments that are said to me now is, why are you using, war on terror rhetoric against these insurgents, not really realizing that there's a real threat here. But I slowly kind of began to realize that, but I also did kind of just like stay silent on Syria for a while, because no matter which side you came down on, you just got attacked, and it was confusing. It's also one of the most heavily propagandized wars I think that's ever taken place, at least in our lifetimes. So we're just like deluged.
We recently interviewed Patrick Coburn, the decades-long award-winning reporter in the Middle East, and he said that in his 30 years of reporting, Syria has had the worst reporting out of any other conflict.
Yeah, we were deluged by an insane amount of propaganda. Also with Syria, there wasn't like good journalism to turn to. I can't think of, Patrick Coburn is somebody whose work has been good, but he's like one voice. There wasn't, the journalism coming out of Syria has been terrible, because it's been so heavily based on propaganda. And also because, the Syrian government's really terrible at dealing with the media, but that's another story. But the point is, because of my own family ties to Syria, I started to understand that obviously the situation is much different than I think it is. So I've always been against intervention. I've always understood the rebels were bad. I never really glorified them or thought they were good. I always understood them to be people who do what they do, which is they advertise, which is eat hearts, or was it like a liver? Or people who ethnically cleanse. I kind of always understood that, but I always, just kind of also the people I was surrounded with, which I now in retrospect, by the way, realize working on Palestine issues, you're involved pretty heavily in the Arab American community. And one of the biggest kept secrets from people who aren't inside the Arab American community is just how sectarian it can be. And as somebody who does come from a minority background, in retrospect, I do realize, I was treated almost like a token in some ways for being the Druze girl who hated the Syrian government. At least it's how I was portrayed. And that was like an asset for certain elements inside the Arab American community who now hate me. And I also realized that I was looked down on for my sect by some people who would then attribute their hatred for the Druze, as they would say, to the fact that the Druze in Israel, I guess, play a prominent role in the police. But that happened to me on quite a number of occasions. And now after one of the reasons I even started talking or caring so much about Syria publicly was because I thought that Hillary Clinton was going to become president. And she was promising to enforce a no-fly zone, and that would have been disastrous. It would have been disastrous for my own family in the region. And so I took an opportunity to visit Syria ahead of the election with a delegation of international journalists, most of whom were from the US and the UK. And I started focusing on Syria, and as a result, I was completely smeared, Brandon and Assadist. I had to resign from the electronic intifada because me being smeared got them smeared, and I didn't want them to go down in flames like I was. And the Arab American community turned on me. A big chunk of it did. And now I realize now the sectarianism has come out even more than I realized it existed before. And this is a really, really big problem that obviously doesn't get talked about, even inside the Arab American community, because almost every Arab American organization is funded by Gulf states at this point. And they push a sectarian narrative, and they push out secular voices and progressive Arab voices like mine. And so they're mostly run by like conservative religious people.
You're talking mainly about CARE, which has been funded. Not
just CARE. A lot of the Arab American organizations, even the ones that aren't so religiously conservative like CARE, receive funding from Gulf governments.
Let's name names here. Let's not dance around the issue.
There's no Arab American political organizations I can think of in DC that will openly even talk about this stuff because of some of the funding that they get.
Definitely the UAE.
Even like Zogby's organization. He doesn't, I don't know that he gets funding from, but they don't say anything about Syria. The U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights at this point, I don't know where their funding stream is coming from, but I suspect that they're receiving funding from some Gulf governments, because they actually are at this point. One of their communications people constantly spends her time online smearing us and smearing prominent names in the Palestine solidarity community.
That may be just because of her personal predilections, but we can say that CARE
for sure.
The Council on American Islamic Relations has been funded by Saudi Arabia. They publicly called for a no-fly zone in Syria
and Libya.
And at the same time, they've said next to nothing on Yemen. They have several figures like Hussam Aylouch in Los Angeles, who has attacked us viciously. Hussam Aylouch cheered on the deaths of band members of the Russian the Red Army band who died in a plane crash. Turned out to be an accident, and he thought they were Russian soldiers, but he said he wanted more dead. I recently saw a video on Orient News, which is an Arabic, very sectarian, pro-opposition channel run, I think out of Saudi Arabia, by a Syrian businessman named Hassan Aboud, featuring Hussam Aylouch, where Hussam Aylouch is talking about running a kind of birthright Syria program where he sends Syrians into rebel-controlled territory from the U.S. Then you have the Syrian American Medical Society, which is kind of part of the CARE network. Zahar Salul has been, a part of CARE. And, CARE Chicago is run by the Syrian American Medical Society's kind of crew. So, this organization sent me on a lot of speaking tours. I spoke at their galas. I remember one time, I was on my Goliath tour, and after a talk I gave, books of Goliath came out, and a group a bunch of men just ran up with their kids to the books and just started tearing the boxes open, fighting to buy my book and to get pictures taken with me. And, I loved being able to address their constituency, who are often regular working people across the country. But you just see that their leadership is pushing the organization in a sectarian direction. They are funded by the Gulf.
Well, and not just the Gulf. Let's not forget the role of Turkey in this as well. Turkey is a very significant power. It has access to a lot of resources and money. It's a NATO member, and Turkey is governed by a right-wing Islamist party, the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, and of course Turkey's right-wing authoritarian president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is himself an Islamist. His party is an informal affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood. Frequently, Muslim Brotherhood front groups will use similar kinds of names, like in Turkey it's called the Justice and Development Party. Under Mohamed Morsi, who was elected president in Egypt, his party was called the Freedom and Justice Party, which was a front for the Muslim Brotherhood. And actually, this is a big factor for me. This was one of the reasons that I began having an awakening on Syria as well. And specifically, it was in early 2015 when there was a campaign led by a lot of Armenian Americans, including Armenian Americans who have been very deeply involved in the Palestine Solidarity movement here. Of course, a quick aside, it's important to know that there is actually a non-insignificant number of Armenian Palestinians who are often forgotten, especially by a lot of these Islamist groups who claim to be pro-Palestinian while working with the Gulf states. But in Turkey's case specifically, it's quite clear that some of these groups get money from groups linked to the Turkish government and the AKP, and this became extremely clear to me in April of 2015 when the U.S. Council on Muslim Organizations, the USCMO, they released a statement. And this press release was called the, quote, Statement on 1915 Turkish-Armenian Events. They called the Armenian genocide just events. That's how extremely whitewashed this absurd statement is. This is fucking genocide denial. They're calling genocide just events. And this statement, which is erasing the genocide of 1.5 million Armenians, planned and intentionally led by the Turkish state. This statement was signed by American Muslims for Palestine, CARE, the Muslim American Society, and several other groups. And when I saw this, I began to question a lot that I had thought about these organizations that claim to support justice and human rights and equality, blah, blah, blah. You can actually read more about all of this in Mondoweiss. They published a really good article in 2015 titled The Moral Hypocrisy of American Muslims for Palestine on the Armenian Genocide. And this was just one of the many factors that helped me begin to realize that a lot of these groups that have horrific reactionary positions on Syria, they're actually reactionary on every conflict in the region. The only thing they're good on is Palestine, but that's because Palestine brings together both right-wing Islamists and left-wing secular forces. And the groups and governments that are bankrolling this, it's not just the Gulf, it's also Turkey.
And they have us in their crosshairs now, but especially you, Rania, because you are a progressive, secular Arab woman who has a big platform on social media and elsewhere, and you're just not going away.
Well, it's also, I mean, these people have branded me not just an Islamophobe at this point, but a Salafi phobe, because I've spoken out about the negative impact of Salafism that Saudi Arabia has spread.
It's so absurd that you're being shut down for talking about the imposition of Wahhabi-style governments in areas where it previously didn't existed, often against the consent of the local population, and you're being called basically a bigot.
Yeah, and by people who are, I'm basically speaking out against an ideology that specifically calls for me to have my rights stripped, like to strip my rights away as a Middle Eastern woman who is from a minority background, just as a woman, to have my rights stripped away. I'm somebody who, I live in the Middle East at this point. I have family there. I have like stake in this game, skin in this game, and I'm being called a bigot. It's basically the equivalent of like a minority in America speaking out against white supremacy and being called a reverse racist. That's like,
yeah, this parallel is actually super fascinating. I think when you look at a lot of the anti-Shia rhetoric, it's so common. You see people talk about, the Shia menace, the Shia crescent, Shia imperialism, Sunni genocide. Take all of that and replace Sunni with white and Shia with black, and you see how the same people who are condemning white supremacy in the U.S. are basically promoting the same absurd ideas in the Middle East. They're saying, the Shia minority is killing the Sunni majority in Sunni genocide. It's like the same thing we hear about white genocide from white supremacists here.
And then our Sunni friends who speak out in defense of us or who are on the same side of us get called self-hating Sunnis. Or they get called self-hating Muslims because some people really just don't see anyone who's non-Sunni as a Muslim.
It's the same logic as Zionism, too. And I think we need to understand that a lot of these people, the people who use the term Salafi phobe seriously, these people are Muslim Zionists.
Yes.
They truly think that if you oppose Islamism, if you oppose political Islam, specifically extremist Salafi forms of it, which are, of course, backed by the CIA, MI6, and Gulf countries, they say that if you oppose that, it's because you're Islamophobic, just as the far-right racist Israeli government says that if you oppose their ethno-supremacist ethno-state, then you are anti-Semitic.
Well, at the same time, there's also they embody the same contradiction that American Jewish Zionists embody, which is that they demand a multicultural liberal society in the West to support them as, people with immigrant backgrounds and to have equal rights, which is something that I support. But at the same time, they demand an ethnically or religiously unique state run along the lines of their sect, whether it's what we would call JSIL, the Jewish state in Israel and the Levant, or a kind of Ikhwan, Muslim Brotherhood-controlled Sunni supremacist Syria that has no place for Syria's very large minority population. That's what they've been wanting, and they generally tend to love Erdogan and AKP, and they're pretty damn happy about what Qatar's doing across the Middle East. So, that hypocrisy you see with Zionists, and you see it, with the CARE crowd as well.
And on the issue of the way that they use the term Islamophobia, you're talking about how this is similar to Zionists in America. I mean, the issue of calling anyone who opposes Israeli policies anti-Semitic, it can be applied here as well. And I think it's where they call anyone who opposes this sort of imposition of Salafi jihadi style governance in the Middle East, you're an Islamophobe. And I think that this is actually really dangerous because we're living in an era when Western governments are controlled by actual Islamophobes, such as Donald Trump, who won on Islamophobia. And they're sort of using this rhetoric that is very real in the U.S. and in the West, and they're sort of confusing progressives and leftists in the U.S. by imposing it on the Middle East, like you mentioned earlier. And it's really, really dangerous because it basically weakens arguments about Islamophobia, I think, because you actually do have Salafi jihadist groups. And one thing I'll add too is it's a huge contradiction because in the Middle East, leftists and progressive and secular voices that actually live there, the people who we obviously support their rights to, I support your right to be a conservative Muslim in the US, anywhere. You have the right to be a conservative Muslim. But at the end of the day, in the Middle East, people who are in care, those are like the right wingers of the Middle East, right? And for my leftist friends in the Middle East, those are their enemies. It doesn't work the same way there. You just cannot impose Western style ideas of Islamophobia onto the Middle East. It makes no sense.
Well, specifically because in the West, we see with the rise of Islamophobia, not just here, but in France, in the Netherlands, with these far-right movements, they don't distinguish among various sects of Islam. So if you're Sunni, if you're Salafi, if you're Deobandi, if you're Sufi, if you're Shia, if you're Ahmadi, it doesn't really matter to them. Islamophobes in the West, these racist Islamophobes, consider all Muslims basically to be the same and will discriminate against you, especially when it comes to hate crimes. And because we see this where Sikhs are attacked, who aren't even Muslim, but they're attacked because racists think they look Muslim, which means they're brown and have a turban, whatever. But that does not apply in the Middle East. In the Middle East, the majority in the Arab world, the majority of people are Muslims.
Are Sunni Muslims.
And they know what their different sects are, and those sects play a very significant role. So we can't impose these different understandings of how Islamophobia functions when in the West it doesn't take into account that sectarianism.
And I really also want to emphasize that it's so offensive to the majority of Sunnis in the Middle East, the way that they get talked about by the people who represent these organizations in the West, because they act as though Sunnis across the Middle East want a Sunni supremacist state or buy into Salafi jihadi ideologies. And at the end of the day, they're just normal, everyday people who want to live normal lives and don't want to live under Al-Qaeda rule as well.
So I mean, talk about your role as an Arab American in our politics, because I think there's been a deliberate effort since on the part of both the FBI and the security services, but also by conservative Islamist elements to push progressive or socialist Arabs out of, the kind of communal organizing. And this has taken a real toll. And I think we witnessed another stage of that when I think you represent a stage of that. And there was this, petition to drive us out of the Palestine solidarity movement. It didn't address any of us, but we knew who it was talking about. Organized by a group of Syrian American exiles. And I know who they are, and I know what their politics are. And their politics are not progressive. Their politics are conservative and sectarian, and they managed to bring a lot of people who had no idea what their agenda was to sign this blacklist, pledging never to work with us again. But I know there's pressure on many other people who are leftist Arabs in the U.S. to either shut their mouth on Syria and just play ball or be driven out. And I can talk about like specific campaigns and organizations that are having an influence on this. I would openly say American Muslims for Palestine, which is, it appeared to me based on my experience at their conferences, is an Islamist oriented organization. I went to one conference where they were essentially raising money for the Syrian opposition, and there was much more energy and interest in Syria than there was at Palestine at that conference. It was deeply disturbing. This group, is doing a lot of sponsoring of the Palestine solidarity movement, and there isn't a lot, and they have a lot of resources. They have a lot of money. I don't see a lot of money from, coming in from the left. So, how has this affected you?
Well, it's affected me in the sense that on a personal level, I have been like purged and I can't write for the outlets I used to write for. They won't publish anything by me, even on the ground reporting. And then when it comes to, the Arab American community, people just act like I don't exist. They used to love me, but now I get treated like I don't exist, except for elements that are proudly like pro-Syrian state. I get treated like I don't exist. But on a broader level here, I think it's kind of making an example. Like you said, other people keep silent. We have Arab friends who have the same views that we do and that are involved in organizing around Palestine, and they have been pushed into silence. They are silent for fear of, being purged from the Palestine solidarity movement, and or in some cases, depending on where they work, purged from their jobs. So they just don't say anything about Syria. And we've seen also this has had the effect of splitting the Palestine movement. Just a couple of years ago, I remember every other month or every month there would be BDS resolutions on various college campuses. Oftentimes they would invite you or Ali Abunimah to come speak. It would be like a huge live streamed event that like the pro-Israel lobby would freak out about. There'd be so much media attention around it. Now I don't see that happening anymore.
Yeah. Max Eil, actually, I heard him on our friend Justin Pordour's podcast, which is really good. It's called Ossington Circle. A few months ago, he said that he believed that divestment resolutions and the debates around them have declined by over 50% in the past year or two. And he believes it's a direct result of Syria, but deliberate efforts by conservative elements to push our voices out. And me and Ali, we were running around the country just kicking the Israel lobby's ass on campus after campus, and there was so much energy. And I really noticed, as also maybe Trump getting elected is some factor. We don't see as much Black Lives Matter organizing, for example, at least on the same national scale. I don't know what it is, but it's just not happening. It's not happening right now. And other figures have come in, or they've tried to insert other figures who just don't really have a background in journalism or scholarship on Palestine. And they haven't really weren't around when the beef was cooking on BDS. And they just kind of came out of nowhere. I also noticed back when I was doing, 3 to 5 talks on campus a week, sometimes certain people would get up and say, "Why is Ali Abunimah an Assad apologist?" And I'd say, "What the fuck are you talking about?" It's clear to me, Ali, he seems to be pretty strongly against intervention in Syria and regime change. He's definitely a leftist-minded figure, someone with a strong, background in scholarship on the Middle East. I'd say he's the closest thing we have to someone continuing Edward Said's legacy. He started the first Palestine-oriented online newsletter in English that exists in the U.S. It's now the Electronic Intifada. And it was pretty clear to me, pretty abundantly clear, that there were elements that were willing to even destroy Ali Abunimah, dispense of him, in order to win this kind of information war on Syria and to just make an example out of everyone, that they would even do away with him. And they're still not stopping.
Oh my God. At this point, how often does Israel bomb Syria, the Syrian government? All the time. And at this point, you have people inside Palestine solidarity circles who have basically been involved in purging us, who cheer on the Israelis when they bomb either the Syrian government or, in some cases, when they are alleged to have bombed Hezbollah.
You reported at the Gray Zone Project at Alternet on a unit of the Free Syrian Army, which is basically like the weapons farm for Al-Qaeda and friends. But it was ostensibly the CIA-backed moderate rebels. That you actually interviewed a former commander of the FSA, who told you that he was in his unit were funded and supported by Israeli intelligence.
Yeah, so this was a group of guys who live in the still controlled by Syria side of the Golan Heights. And they defected from the Syrian army for various reasons when the uprising took place and the FSA was formed, and they joined these Free Syrian Army brigades in the Golan, until some of them realized or learned that the Israelis were actually coordinating with these FSA brigades in the Golan. And that was a red line for them, because you also have to understand, people who live on the Syrian side of the Golan have family on the Israeli occupied side. That is a huge red line for them to have anything to do with Israel. Israel is like the enemy, first and foremost for them. And so once they learned of this, they basically defected from the FSA, and not back to the Syrian army, but to the NDF, the National Defense Forces, which was formed after the insurgency took over large parts of the country, kind of like a paramilitary group that works in tandem with the Syrian army. And so now they are in charge of this. They have this big brigade in the Golan Heights area that fights alongside the Syrian army against the insurgents. And that is why they defected from it. And they told me not only that, but that the Israeli Air Force would come in whenever they were fighting insurgents and start bombing the Syrian army. Clearly these insurgent groups, which at this point had become dominated by Al-Qaeda, were coordinating with the Israeli Air Force, because whenever they were about to lose and in a battle with the Syrian army, the Israeli Air Force would show up and bomb the Syrian army side.
So I brought up that, that story, that report you wrote from the ground in the Golan, just to kind of illustrate how obvious it is that Israel and the Syrian armed opposition are at least operationally on the same side, if not directly coordinating together. We saw the importance of Syrian air defenses, not only, against Western cruise missiles, but also when an Israeli F-16 was downed by the Syrian army. And it was the rebels, the insurgents, who had set themselves to destroying Syrian air defenses whenever they captured an area or a military base to make it easier for Israel and other Western allies to bomb Syria. So it's so obvious that this is the dynamic playing out now, and yet we've seen no contrition by anyone who signed that petition to basically marginalize us. I wouldn't even say the petition necessarily worked or not, but it's just that anyone who supported regime change in Syria, who claims to be dedicated to the liberation of Palestine, should be completely ashamed of themselves at this point, because it's so obvious that they're operationally taking the same side as the state of Israel.
Yeah, and I think there are a few things to address here. But first of all, the fact that they're still going on with these talking points is so outrageous when you consider that it's not just independent progressive media that has reported this stuff. It's not just like the reporting from journalists like Rania. This has been acknowledged in mainstream media outlets, like the notorious Assadist rag, the Wall Street Journal. I mean, the Wall Street Journal has actually done really good reporting on Israel's support for the rebels in Syria. And specifically, they did a report which was published a few days after a very similar report by the Lebanese journalist Noor Samaha in Syria Deeply, which means the Wall Street Journal report could have actually been a stolen story.
Potentially.
But anyway, the Wall Street Journal interviewed a spokesperson for Fursan al-Jolan, which is the rebel group Knights of the Jolan in the Golan Heights. And the spokesperson said, quote, "Israel stood by our side in a heroic way." And then the spokesperson added, quote, "We wouldn't have survived without Israel's assistance." So you have a so-called moderate rebel admitting in the Wall Street Journal that they would not have survived without Israel's support, but we still have people in the pro-Palestine movement who support these same Syrian rebels. And not only is that intense cognitive dissonance that's ignoring basic facts, but I also think it's reflective of what we were talking about earlier, and that's how tightly controlled not just the media outlets are, but some of these groups are by Gulf regimes and Gulf money. And it's not just Gulf regimes themselves, but specifically rich donors in the Gulf. We see this with Asfari, the Syrian British billionaire who bankrolls a lot of stuff. But then there's also a lot of rich donors behind the scenes from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, the UAE. And we see that in the past 2 years, Saudi Arabia has always been a kind of unofficial ally of Israel. It's been clear that the US, UK, Saudi Arabia, and Israel are part of this axis, and for the most part, they work together. But it just becomes so blatant, specifically under Mohammed bin Salman, the butcher of Yemen, who's loved by Thomas Friedman in the Western media in Saudi Arabia.
And The Rock. He smells what The Rock is cooking.
Yeah, when MBS was in the US, he met with not just The Rock, but also Bill Clinton, the heads of JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, Oprah, tons of billionaires. But anyway, now Saudi Arabia and Israel are having secret meetings in Egypt. In meetings with pro-Israel groups here in the U.S., Mohammed bin Salman is saying the Palestinians should, quote, shut up. Saudi Arabia is buying drones from Israel. There's clearly direct coordination going on. And they've all moved into this very clear alliance against Iran and Iran's allies, including Syria. So there might have been an excuse several years ago when you could say, well, it's not entirely clear what side Israel is taking. But for the past, since at least 2015, if not earlier, it's been incredibly clear that Israel has been a key supporter of the opposition in Syria. And you cannot claim to be a pro-Palestine activist and support the Syrian rebels that are backed by Israel.
And how is it going to work out that more Western interference and involvement in the Middle East is going to be productive for Palestine? Because that's the logical conclusion that you have to come to if you support intervention in Syria. How is it a bad thing that the U.S. is being pushed out along with these Gulf governments that have been basically created in part to sell out and destroy Arab nationalism and the Palestinian cause in specific. How is that bad? And why do we constantly have to see these attacks on the Western left from people who claim to support Palestine? Like, what do you think the Western left is? Like, it's really the only element of people who are not born into supporting Palestine that do. Basically, you just want to like systematically urinate on the people who've gone against their whole community and gone against their families and gone against everything, their society, to support Palestinian rights. And that's what we've just seen again and again from this rancid conservative or liberal crowd. I don't know. There's so many different elements. You know, Jayshal Grad School in SOAS and NYU. You have the woke Islamists who are against Salafi phobia. Whatever they are, they're just constantly pissing on the Western left. And that to me is just, it's so offensive. And the attacks on anti-imperialists, I mean, really gives away their whole game, because it means that they're really in the Western camp. And I'm sorry, Palestine is not going to be liberated as long as the U.S. is in the Middle East. As the goal should be to remove the U.S. and its allies from the Middle East. That's really what the goal is. It's not gonna. You're not going to see a change in Palestine otherwise. And we're actually slowly starting to see that change take place, and they're upset about it.
On that note, it might be a good moment just to bring up that a lot of these same people constantly make, and from every crowd you just mentioned, constantly make this comparison between Palestine and Syria, that the opposition in Syria is just like Hamas or anybody fighting Israel and Palestine, and the Syrian army is basically the equivalent of the Israeli army. And I think that this has been a really destructive narrative that's been promoted on the left inside the Palestine solidarity community, and has actually led a lot of people to side with the regime changers.
As I mentioned, it initially captivated my active imagination and had me for a little while.
Well, I just want to stress a couple reasons why that's a really inaccurate comparison. I think first and foremost, Palestine is a really black and white issue, at least compared to Syria. Palestinians were minding their own business, and Zionism was imposed on them supported by imperial powers from the West. It's a settler colonial conflict where Palestinians' land has been stolen. They're being ethnically cleansed and being pushed out of their land, being replaced by Jews. That's the situation in Israel-Palestine. It's very basic, very simple.
It's settler colonialism.
Yes. The natives, the indigenous people are that's the side you should be on, right? Whereas in Syria, this is not a situation of settler colonialism. Yes, the Syrian government has its issues, but the Syrian Arab army is not the Israeli army. They're not a settler army. They are an army made up of the indigenous population of Syria.
Most of which is Sunni, by the way, which is never acknowledged. The majority of the Syrian Arab army consists of Sunnis.
Yes, exactly, because the majority of Syria is Sunnis. And the point is that this is an indigenous army. The government is indigenous, whether you like it or not, whether they're Baathists or not. They are the indigenous people of that country, and they are dealing with a war from outsiders. And if anything, Syria, you had all these foreign fighters who flooded into Syria to join the jihadi opposition. If anything, they have more in common with the foreign fighters who joined the Israeli army from all around the world out of some religious, duty to come join the Zionist project. In the case of Syria, it was a religious duty to come, join the Mujahideen project, whatever the hell you want to call it, to impose an Islamic state. So those are just a couple of the things, but also it depends, I think, most importantly, when people try to say, but you support Hamas. Now, first of all, I don't support Hamas politically, but I do believe they have a right to defend Palestinians, right? This is not the same as the insurgents in Syria, because it matters what people are fighting for. That is one of the things that is lost on the left, because the left is always taken in or drawn in by this idea of a romanticized liberation movement. And that's how the insurgents in Syria have been sold to us in the West as some sort of liberation movement. But that's not what they're fighting for. They're not fighting for liberation. Those insurgent groups have been fighting, many of them, to impose an Islamic state, to overthrow the Syrian government and impose a Salafi jihadi Saudi-style state. That is not something that should be supported, regardless of who of where. If that was the case in Palestine, if there was a movement that was beheading people, of Palestinians that was beheading people, and ethnically cleansing minorities, that would not be a movement you'd want to support just because it was Palestinian.
Yeah, and what's also interesting is differentiating among the different Palestinian resistance groups, because this is another one of those points, like Israel's support for the Syrian rebels, that is really never acknowledged because it just blatantly exposes how politically and morally bankrupt the Syrian opposition is. Hamas, early in the war in Syria, came out in support of the Syrian opposition, which was largely dominated by, similar Muslim Brotherhood style Islamist groups. But then in the past few years, Hamas has really backtracked majorly and has, specifically since the Israeli massacre in Gaza in 2014, has really repaired its relations with Iran. And now Iran and Hamas actually are on pretty good terms.
And Hamas, by the way, condemned the recent U.S., French, British airstrikes or cruise missile strikes on Syria.
They're Assadists.
Well, and then also specifically, Hamas is not the only Palestinian resistance group. In fact, of the various groups, it probably has the worst politics. This isn't even to mention the PFLP, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. What's so funny is you'll see some of these young student activists who support the Syrian opposition who will wear shirts of Layla Khaled. But Layla Khaled, who is, by the way, a secular Marxist-Leninist from the communist PFLP, if you read her interviews, she has said very clearly, the PFLP published a statement in April of 2017 when the U.S. bombed Syrian government targets. And the PFLP published on its website, quote, PFLP denounces U.S. imperialist aggression against Syria. And if you read interviews with PFLP figures and Layla Khaled, they say very clearly that they support the Syrian government and the Syrian army fighting these foreign-backed Islamist groups. And then if you read, Layla Khaled did an interview in which she said, this was in 2013, Layla Khaled said, quote, the latest developments in Syria clearly indicate that there is a U.S.-Turkish Saudi alliance with the goal of destroying and weakening Syria as a country because it has said no to the U.S. and has not signed agreements with the Zionist entity and hosts 500,000 Palestinian refugees. So you can't wear a Layla Khaled shirt and talk about how great the PFLP is and Palestinian resistance groups are and support the Syrian opposition in contradiction with those Palestinian resistance groups. Hamas is not the only Palestinian resistance group.
Absolutely. And, one of the kind of talking points of the Syrian opposition and its supporters is that there's been this kind of Syrian government war on the Palestinian refugee population in Syria, leaving out the real frontline role that pro-government Palestinian militias like Liwa al-Quds have played, but also the real facts on the ground in the Palestinian camp of Yarmouk, with the situation is not so clear cut. There's an offensive underway right now in Yarmouk. And Rania, I think you would probably know the most about what's going on there.
Well, what I wanted to note about the PFLP is that Yarmouk, right, it's called a refugee camp, but really it's more of like a big neighborhood or like a big town that hosts Palestinian refugees who are basically Syrian, and also lots of Syrians live there. And it's portrayed as an attack on Palestinians by the government. But the way that issue with the conflict in Yarmouk started is the opposition there, which Hamas had initially joined, the Hamas branch inside Yarmouk had initially joined, attacked the PFLP GC or the general command there by like burning down their building and shooting the people inside. So it hasn't been this clear-cut conflict between the Syrian government and Palestinians. It actually started out as somewhat of a Palestinian conflict inside Yarmouk. And Hamas actually ultimately split inside Yarmouk. Initially, they fought with the opposition, but then the opposition became Nusra. And so half of them split and like defected and went and fought on the government side and joined some of the Palestinian brigades. And then the other half joined Nusra and ISIS, which ultimately took over Yarmouk. And that has been the fight in Yarmouk. Not some, the Syrian government's just going around like massacring Palestinians because they hate Palestinians. Like that's the way it's being portrayed. But it's actually a conflict where an insurgency, in this case ISIS, took over Yarmouk. And I met people who fled Yarmouk, and you asked them why they fled or who they were fleeing, and they were like, everyone just started fighting. And that's pretty much what you hear from most people who flee areas of Syria. It's not so clear cut. The government just started bombing us. It's like insurgents entered our areas and fighting started.
It's like Nahr al-Bared in Lebanon in 2005 or 6 Damascus, was it?
Where Salafis, entered.
Yeah, a Salafi group basically that had been sent through Syria, was dumped in Lebanon, engaged in some conflict and nested up in the Palestinian camp of Nahr al-Bared, which was eventually burned down by the Lebanese army. When I was in Beirut, I spoke to a PFLP leader I think it was in Shatila or Borj el Brajne, another Palestinian camp, and he told me how he witnessed the offensive and how the Lebanese army, it's comprised of all these different sects, and so one person would be burning down some of the Palestinian homes, and then another one would rush in and try to save them and try to prevent the destruction because they had different tendencies towards Palestinians based on whether they were, for example, Maronite or Sunni Muslim. And so the army itself was, behaving in a schizophrenic way. But the point is that the offensive wasn't ostensibly directed against Palestinians, but Palestinians wound up being the biggest victim of all of the different regional conspiracies and the geopolitical games that were taking place around them. And Palestinians, essentially, in this, particularly the refugees, they just generally don't want to get involved in the politics of their host country because their ultimate goal is to return home.
Yeah, and on this point on Yarmouk, this is also interesting because earlier we were talking about what shifted our views. And one of the things that shifted my views was specifically about Yarmouk, because this is one of the most insidious talking points used by some of these young supporters of the Syrian opposition. They'll be like, oh, well, Assad is killing Palestinians in Yarmouk. And when I didn't really know much about the war in Syria, that was a convincing argument. And one of the people who actually helped me see how ridiculous that position was Asad Abu Khalil. And Asad Abu Khalil, he gets criticized from both sides, but he's been an incredibly principled observer, really, on many issues for decades, but specifically since the 2011 protests, he's been extremely critical of a lot of this whole Arab Spring branding. But he's also not an Assadist. He's not an apologist for dictators. He's actually been very principled on all of these issues. And on his website, the Angry Arab News Service, Asad Abu Khalil criticized me. This was in January 2015 because I had written an article in Mondoweiss about Yarmouk, because I was talking to a lot of these people who were raising awareness of Yarmouk and the siege in Yarmouk.
In Brooklyn, New York.
And of course, what happened in Yarmouk is a complete tragedy. But Asad Abu Khalil, when I spoke with him and he pointed out, his criticism was entirely valid, that in my article, I did not once acknowledge who the rebels were that controlled Yarmouk and what they were doing. They were, of course, hoarding food. They were shooting aid convoys. They were attacking civilians and torturing civilians. Of course, I didn't mention any of that. I just said, oh, this is a one-sided evil siege.
They were also Ben, they were ISIS.
Yeah. Well, and then in April, 3 months after my article was published, ISIS took over Yarmouk. And then I was like, well, I got that wrong, that's for sure. Because I didn't, at that point, it's still way too late, 2015. It should have been absolutely clear. But by 2015, this is the point where you have ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, Syrian al-Qaeda, just steamroll over all the remaining rebel groups and just take over everything. And since 2015, for 3 years now, ISIS has been in control of Yarmouk. And the people who were talking about, Assad killing the Palestinians in Yarmouk have either been silent or have ignored the fact that they were talking about ISIS.
Ben, just kind of on that note.
Yeah, good call. We're approaching an hour here, so we're going to have to end part 2 of our discussion with Rania Khalek. But please join us for part 3, which will be the final hour-long segment in this lengthy discussion with Rania Khalek and Max Blumenthal. In the third part, we'll talk in much more detail about some of the propaganda on Syria, the pro-opposition propaganda, specifically coming from so-called leftist groups, most of which are Trotskyite groups. Specifically, we'll talk about the International Socialist Organization and get into more detail as to what the actual networks are pushing out a lot of this disinformation that is ultimately pro-war and pro-empire. On that note, thanks for listening to Moderate Rebels. Please join us soon for part 3.